Hi everybody, thank you for coming. I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're now at just gone past. The research that I'm presenting today is actually part of a wider research project exploring the role of women in Manx politics. And this is the project team. We are multidisciplinary, encompassing law, gender studies, history and legal history. And the aims of the project are to highlight the lack of gender diversity in Manx politics, both historically and today, and to explore the experiences of women in Manx politics. And we were lucky enough to receive funding from Culture Vannin to enable us to undertake this part of the project. And ultimately, we would like to find ways to remove barriers and to encourage more women to stand for election on the island. We have a project website. If you search for Women in Manx Politics, it should come up. There are some business cards out in the hall there. Please feel free to take one. And there's a link to our blog on that as well, so please do go and have a look. Now, the research that I'm going to talk to you about today forms part of the historical strand, looking specifically at women's engagement in Manx politics during the second half of the 20th century. And I want to start with just a little bit of context. So you probably all know that the Isle of Man was the first jurisdiction to give some women the vote in 1881, specifically widows and unmarried women of property. I've started, yeah. Well, I wasn't. Yeah, go on. Yeah. Uh-huh.
This is a lovely room and there's lots of light. We ordered a new projector 8 months ago. Supply chains in the world. Some of these slides are not as big as we would normally like a bigger one. I would encourage you at the back, as much as the back is a comfortable place for most of us, to come forward, just in case some of the slides lose their bit.
If you can't see, come to the front.
My introduction was going to be, this is Dr. Catriona Mackie, she's magnificent.
Oh, thank you. So, some women eligible for the vote, 1881. And this is followed by universal suffrage in 1919. And at that same time, women become eligible to stand for the keys. But it's not until 1961 that women are eligible for election to the Legislative Council. And this mirrors to an extent the situation in the UK, where women become eligible to stand for Parliament in 1918, but aren't eligible to take up seats in the House of Lords until 1958. And lastly, women weren't eligible to sit on Manx juries until 1980, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. Now, although women became eligible to stand for election in 1919, it wasn't until 1929 that the first women did so. Now, in that year, Louisa Nelson decides to stand for Ramsey constituency, but she wasn't elected. And hers is a very interesting story that we hope to be able to tell in a later blog post. In 1933, Marion Shimmin was elected as MHK for Peel. Now, her husband, Christopher Shimmin, had been elected for Peel at every general election since 1919. Now, he and his wife were both members of the Manx Labour Party, and when Christopher Shimmin died in post, his wife was elected unopposed, becoming the first woman member of the House of Keys. And at the general election the following year, she was again elected unopposed. So that's the context. Now, what I'd like to do now is tell you some stories. 3 case studies of women who were elected to the House of Keys after the Second World War. And in exploring the political lives of these women, what I'd like to do is draw out some of the relevant issues that each of them exemplify in relation to political parties, political profile and political progression. We're going to start with Annie Bryson and the role of political parties on the island. Now, her story goes back to the founding of the Manx Labour Party in February 1918. She joined the party that year, and in 1922, she became the first woman president of the party at the age of 29. She met her husband, Gerald Bryson, through the Manx Labour Party, and they married in 1928. Now, in 1919, Gerald had become the youngest ever MHK when he was elected as a Labour Party member at the age of 26. He lost his seat at the next election and wasn't elected again until 1942. Now, come 1946, both Annie and Gerald decide to stand for election. Now, by this time, they had both fallen out with the Labour Party following a dispute about the minimum wage bill, and as a result, they both stood for the Ex-Servicemen's Association. They'd both served during the Second World War, and they felt strongly that the needs of ex-servicemen were not being met. Neither were elected. But it's notable that Annie missed out by only 14 votes to another new candidate, George Higgins. She was undaunted by her loss in 1946, and she went on to stand for the seat of Garth in 1951. By this time, she and Gerald were back on good terms with the Manx Labour Party, and she stood as a Labour Party candidate. She was elected behind Charles Courish, who some of you may remember, and in the process, she displaced a sitting candidate, John Quine. Annie Bridson therefore becomes the second woman to be elected to the House of Keys, and she served her term as the only woman in the House. Now, away from politics, Annie had trained as a primary school teacher and eventually became a headmistress. She was heavily involved in the Manx branch of the National Union of Teachers, but when she got married in 1928, she gave up her job, as was expected of women at the time. But she remained passionate about teaching, and she was elected to the Manx Education Authority in 1935. Now, unfortunately, we don't have a record of any of her campaign material, but we do have a few reports from the Manx press. At a campaign event in October in 1951, she told her audience that it was time for women to take a greater interest in Manx politics. I'm sorry there are no other women candidates in the field, because I think women could give much needed advice in the Keys. There are so many things on which women's opinions should be heard: education, social services, health services, and above all, housing. Men build houses, but women have to live and work in them. I appeal to all the women folk to think seriously about a woman candidate. So she was appealing particularly to women voters as a woman candidate. She also felt strongly that all women should be able to vote for elections for parish commissioners, because at that time, women could vote in general elections, but as Annie said, they're not considered to have wit enough to vote for commissioners. I think the parish is where they should start to learn the power of their vote, because they know the people intimately. That is one of the things the Labour Party feels strongly about. Now, in 1955, when the local government bill came before the Keys, and this is the bill that would allow anybody over the age of 21 to vote for commissioners, Annie Bridson strongly supported it. She said, "As a woman member, I am really surprised and amused at the attitude of quite a number of men here. You might think we were back in the 1880s with father the only person who mattered. Are we going to be compared with Japan, where the women are just household utensils? I ask you, as men, to give the fully grown women the right to vote in these elections. They have every right to expect it." She supported equal rights for women in other ways. In a debate on standard drinking measures, one MHK proposed smaller measures should be allowed, because women who drank cocktails couldn't possibly cope with a full measure. She responded, "I'm quite surprised at the Honourable Member for Ramsay on his objection for giving a standard measure and saying that a woman is not capable of holding the full value of her money, so therefore you can adulterate her drink ad lib. I think if a woman wants a gin in it, she should have it. Women pay the same price." Annie Bridson chose not to stand for re-election in 1956 due to her husband's failing health. But her story highlights the issue of party politics on the Isle of Man. The island is unusual among its neighbouring jurisdictions in that there is no strong party system, with most candidates standing as independents. Now, this graph shows the number of candidates in each general election who stood as independents, that's the blue line at the top, or who were affiliated with a political party, that's the black line at the bottom. I'm not sure how well you can see that. And it's in the two post-war elections of 1946 and 1951 that we see the highest percentage of candidates belonging to a particular political party. Now, these elections were contested by a wide range of different parties, most of them fielding candidates in only some constituencies. But it's worth highlighting the contribution of the Manx Labour Party. Now, not only was it the first political party to be established on the island, it's also the only party to have contested every general election since 1919. And if we look at the number of candidates with a party affiliation who stood across all general elections from 1946 to 1996, 56% of all party candidatures belonged to the Manx Labour Party. So it's made a not insignificant contribution to the political landscape on the island. Now, Annie Brideson's own political exposure was quite high. As a member of the Labour Party, she had the opportunity to present at its conferences, and we know she gave a talk on education at its very first conference. And she would have had the support of and drawn on the knowledge of her party peers, some of whom had served as MHKs. Her husband served 2 terms as MHK, which would have given her significant insight into the workings of government. And in this way, her story mirrors that of Marion Shimon, another Labour Party candidate who followed her husband into the Keys. But party affiliation can have disadvantages. Candidates of the Manx Labour Party would have suffered the highs and lows of the party's fortunes in the polls. For example, the party suffered significant defeats in the 1946 election, losing 2 of their 4 seats, probably due to the success of the UK Labour Party in the 1945 election and the concerted efforts of Conservative candidates on the island in the wake of the UK party's success. And I have to give credit to one of my recent History and Heritage graduates, Nick Moore, for flagging this up in his dissertation last year. So, although Annie Bridson and her husband stood for the Ex-Servicemen's Association in 1946, it's possible that they were both tainted by their prior association with the Labour Party. Now, there is some evidence, but we have to be quite cautious because we're dealing with very small numbers here, but there is some evidence to suggest that women standing for election with a party affiliation stood a similar chance of being elected as men standing with a party affiliation. In contrast, women who stood as independents had much less chance of being elected than male independent candidates. And just to go very briefly back to this graph, the peak in the number of independent candidates that you can see in 1986 and 1991 is likely because in these years, the electoral system adopted a form of proportional representation, a single transferable vote, and that seems to have attracted more candidates. And although we do see some women being elected in 86 and 91, the limited data that we have doesn't suggest that there was any particular advantage to women candidates of the proportional representation system, nor do we see more women standing as a proportion of candidates during this time. Now, our second case study is of Jean Thornton Dewsbury, and through her story, we are going to look at the public and political profile of the women who were elected. She was born in London in 1907, and the family moved to the island in 1925 when her father was appointed as Lord Bishop of Sodor and Man. When he died 3 years later, Jean and her mother returned to England. However, after the outbreak of war in 1939, they returned to the Isle of Man to live permanently. Now, by this time, Jean was a trained midwife and a registered nurse, and she had worked both in London and in Jerusalem. In 1946, she was elected to the Manx Education Authority and served as its chair in 1951-52. She became a Justice of the Peace in 1957. Now, in 1966, she decided to stand for election in Garth. She was duly elected, becoming only the 3rd woman member of the House of Keys. She notes in her manifesto that she decided to put herself forward for election because some constituents asked her to. Having been approached to stand in Garth as a candidate in Garth Sheeding, I have agreed, although I realise I have not a great deal of experience in the political field. It's not exactly a hard sell, although she does note that she was a member of the Education Authority for 10 years. Of her politics, she describes herself as an independent progressive candidate who generally supports present-day policy and government. It's just what every government likes to have. And she highlights particular areas where she thinks a woman could have beneficial input, including social issues, noting that a sympathetic understanding of those problems might constitute a sphere where I could be of assistance. On the whole, though, she doesn't make much of an effort to sell herself, and her manifesto runs to a single page. But despite this, she managed to unseat a Manx Labour Party incumbent to take 2nd place and become a member of the House of Keys. How did she do it? Well, between 1945 and 1997, 38 women stood for election to the House of Keys, and 10 of them, these 10 here, were successful. 8 of them had some form of political experience before they were elected. 4 of them had previously been elected to the Manx Education Authority, or the Board of Education as it later became. 2 had been appointed as Justices of the Peace. 2 had been elected as Commissioners, and 2 were local councillors. In addition, 1 had a father who was an MHK. Now, being elected as a Commissioner or a Councillor, or being elected to the Education Authority, all involved campaigning in your constituency. So not only did these women have some knowledge of the workings of government through their elected positions, they also had experience of campaigning and knowledge of their constituents. Pam Crow at the bottom here, who didn't have any previous political position, was very engaged in local cultural activities as well as being in business, so she was already well known in her constituency prior to standing for election. It's also notable that all of the women were professionals, and prior to 1996, 6 of the 8 women elected were either teachers or nurses, professions that were mostly associated with women at that time. Now, Jean Thornton Dewsbury was re-elected to the House of Keys in 1991, and she was joined by 2 other women, both elected for the first time, Elspeth Quayle for Castletown and Catherine Cowan for East Douglas. This was the first time that more than 1 woman sat in the House of Keys. In a talk she gave to the Business and Professional Women's Clubs in 1974, she said, "I'm glad to say that we are now accepted as a matter of course, and lady members are no longer regarded as a noteworthy phenomenon." In the House of Keys, she moved a number of bills, some of which specifically focused on equality for women, including the jury bill, which would allow women to serve on juries. Introducing the bill, she said, "In doing this, I am voicing the conviction of very large groups of thoughtful and informed women in this island, and I believe honourable members will join me in feeling that it is right that their voice should be heard on this matter in this honourable House." Now, Jean Thornton Dewsbury didn't actually take this bill any further, and I'm not sure why, but instead it was taken forward by another woman MHK, Betty Hanson. And this brings us to our final case study and the issue of political progression. Betty Hanson was elected to the House of Keys in a 1974 by-election. She was a school teacher, and prior to standing for election, she had served 3 years on the Board of Education. In addition to her experience with the board, she regularly viewed debates from the public galleries, both in the House of Keys and in the Legislative Council, and she was well known in her constituency through her engagement with various church and community groups. Like Jean Thornton Dewsbury, she said that she was encouraged to stand for election. The phone started ringing. Then I was stopped in the street and letters began to arrive. It was apparent people wanted me to stand, so I decided to give it a go. And interestingly, she also noted that her husband was fully supportive of her campaign, and had he not been, she would never have put herself forward. Unfortunately, we haven't managed to get hold of Betty Hanson's 1974 manifesto. If anybody happens to have a copy, please do get in touch. But her candidature was covered in the island's newspapers. So a few days before the election, this article appeared in the Isle of Man Examiner. The author wrote, "Mrs Hanson, wife of the headmaster of Albert Road School, Ramsey, is a woman of sound common sense. Talking to her, it becomes obvious that she's capable of seeing the other side's view. She's more logical than the average woman." In the same article, we are given a little insight into the views of some members of Tynwald on the role of women in Manx politics. Last week, when I interviewed Deemster George Moore, he told me he was in favour of women members of the legislature, that he considered they could contribute usefully, especially in matters of health, social security and in education, which was manifestly suited to women. Now, Betty Hanson didn't feel that she should be restricted to those areas that the Deemster considered to be manifestly suited to women. She also felt that she could contribute on economic issues. The same newspaper article noted that Betty Hanson thinks she can contribute consumer-wise. She says, "Women are the housekeepers. They are managing the money all the time. Men are not." Now, Betty Hanson's election to the House of Keys took the total number of women sitting to 4. In January 1975, the Speaker of the House noted that with your election to the important constituency of West Douglas, there are now in our House 4 lady members, 1/6 of its total assembly, a unique proportion of any parliamentary assembly within the Commonwealth. Betty Hanson was re-elected in both 1976 and in 1981, and it's interesting that she campaigned on the promise to represent both the women's and the men's point of view. She contributed in many areas of policy, including issues relating to equality for women. For example, she took forward the jury bill that had been introduced by Jean Thornton Dewsbury in 1974 to finally allow women to sit on juries. On her re-election in 1976, she was appointed chair of the Board of Education. That same year, Elspeth Quayle, the only other woman in the Keys, was appointed as chair of the Board of Forestry, Mines and Lands. And this is the first time that a woman MHK was given such a role. Betty Hanson later became chair of the Board of Consumer Affairs, and I can't help feeling that that would have given her some element of satisfaction. By 1981, she was nominated for the government's Executive Council, but was not appointed. However, in 1982, she became the first woman member of the Legislative Council, only 21 years after women became eligible. Now, any conclusions that we might offer at the moment are limited and preliminary. Caveat. Political parties are often seen as part of the solution to the lack of female representation in politics. But this raises an issue for those polities that don't operate under a party system. So how do we improve the representation of women in a context without political parties? Now, the tentative results that we've found that suggest that women standing for a political party have a greater chance of success than women standing as independents might actually simply be skewed by the success of the Manx Labour Party. Difficult to tell at the moment. Public profile and political experience might have been significant. However, we haven't yet looked closely at the profiles of those women who were unsuccessful in their campaigns. But it's likely that those women who had campaigned for public office previously would have had some advantage over those who hadn't. It's also likely that the knowledge and insight gained through such a public role would have benefited candidates. In terms of political progression, from 1976, there doesn't seem to be any reluctance to appoint women to any significant positions within the legislature. And of the 10 women who were elected to the House of Keys during the period 1945 to 1997, 5 of them gained significant positions as chair, minister or MLC. Now, in the case studies that we've looked at today, there's clearly some discussion around the types of issues that are more suitable for women. This is reflected, for example, in the comments of Deemster Moore, but also in the campaign literature and in the Manx press. And this sort of gender profiling can be found in other jurisdictions. And in the Isle of Man, as elsewhere, some female politicians rejected it, some embraced it, and some did both for tactical reasons. And all of these issues, we hope, will be explored further as the project continues. Thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions, I'll pass them on to my co-author, Peter Edge. Anything? No? Yeah.
You mentioned the Board of Education as being an important thing. And firstly, how many of us were actually elected in a literal sense? In other words, because I seem to remember that in the past, there were very often people who were elected or opposed to those positions.
You mean how many had
actually fought a campaign, if you like?
Who were not elected unopposed?
Yes.
I don't know, we haven't looked at that data.
Yes, yeah. Because that seems to be...
But it was an election in the sense that everybody had a vote.
Had to stand, and you don't know whether you're going to be opposed or not.
Yeah.
And I wonder, the other thing on that is it possible, because of course the Board of Education as a representative body was effectively abolished 10, 15 years ago, is it possible that if you like, almost diverted women away from, although some used it then as a stepping stone, that diverted women away to what was seen as more suitable to the legal sphere, rather than going directly.
I don't know, and I don't know that the women who were elected to the Board of Education necessarily at that time saw it as a stepping stone into politics. Maybe some of them did. And I think, if we look at the situation today, we do see some women going directly into politics, and we see others coming through a more circuitous route. Again, at this stage in the project, we're not really in a position to evaluate the extent to which women are sort of consciously making those types of decisions to seek an elected office as a route into politics.
There's one other little point, have you been looking at the other islands as comparison?
Not yet, no, we haven't. But we are hoping that as a good example of a small nation state, that the results we get here will be applicable to others as well.
Because yeah. Similar, again, you looked at this year's Jersey election.
Exactly. Yeah. Great, thank you very much.
Catriona, thank you. Just got a few minutes now before we change over. I could listen to Catriona forever, because just about every word you say is engaging and interesting and thought-provoking. So thank you, and also to obviously Peter and Alex and Maria in the background. There's going to be, one of the things that we do at UCM is we have a UCM talk series, online talks throughout the winter, although, into spring really. And Catriona and the team are going to give another update on the project in May. So one of that's our final UCM talks for the academic year, and the schedule for that is on our website. So that'll be great in another sort of 6 months' time to see where you've gone. I don't know if you made the connection, but we have got a female MHK in the room. I just thought, in 1 minute before we go on to the next presentation, Dr. Michelle Haywood, who's MHK for Russian. Yes. Russian, one of the MHKs Russian. No, it was like that comment about Russian health, isn't it? But in terms of your journey into politics, you may just say a moment. I mean, you would.
I was looking at that and thinking I ended up in the local commissioners before I ended
right,
up,
that's right.
and it was invaluable experience to be in local government prior to going into national government. Yeah. It certainly sets you up for understanding how it works. There was a lot of chiming there, and it wasn't like I went into local politics as a stepping stone. So I think the comment that you made that they didn't see it as that is absolutely right. But I think there's a kind of, you take that first step as a way of getting involved, because for me it was about changing things and making them better. Very altruistic.
Yes. One other thing that I meant to say at the end is that one of the elements of the project that we're hoping to engage with is we would really like to conduct a focus group to speak to women who have seriously considered standing for election but ultimately decided not to. So if any of you in the room yourselves, or if you know anybody who has seriously considered standing but ultimately decided not to, there are some business cards. In fact, I've got some here. I'm just going to leave them at the front. Please take a business card away with you and just send me an email.
Great.
We'd really like to hear from you, because I can imagine it's quite difficult to get in touch with women who ultimately...
The wannabes. The wannabes that didn't, but didn't.
Now as well, because the progression from the House of Keys to Legislative Council is not that retirement route.
Yeah.
So anymore.
Yes.
It attracts an open field of candidates, and it would be interesting to understand why. And I stood for LegCo because an existing MHK came and spoke to me and said, we think you'd be good at it, and that was, I didn't get in, and that's fine, and that subsequently fired me to stand for election. But my personality type is I wouldn't have gone for a general election because I don't like that.
The public canvassing and selling yourself.
It's brutal. It's physically incredibly hard. It's really long days. There's lots of doors that you have to go and knock on because that's how it works here. I wore out 2 pairs of shoes. I did hours and hours. I was doing 18,000 steps a day for weeks on end. And so if you are not physically able to do that, or you can't find time because you're full-time employment or you have caring responsibilities, you're never going to get through that process. And so it disadvantages everyone by the fact that that's how our candidates have to work to get elected.
I think one of the reasons why it takes us a long time to see women being elected to Legislative Council is because of that tendency to elect MHKs, to see that as their form of progression, and with so few women in the keys. Luckily, that has all changed.